Welcome to True Crime Cases, where we explore the sinister and twisted tales of shocking real-life crimes communities and do permanent damage. Today's episode tells a story I was. Dawn had just risen when my father-in-law made me sleep with him in order to conceive while my spouse is infertile. Long shadows are thrown by the horizon across the sandy alleys of Shinur. The air in the village, which was tucked away in Uttar Pradesh, India, was heavy with the aroma of incense and marigolds. 18-year-old Priya was the telltale indicator that a wedding was going to happen in a little cottage on the outskirts of the hamlet. Remained still as her aunts and mother fussed over her, covering her in a red. Priya's dark eyes, which are typically brilliant with inquiry and intelligence, were now embroidered with gold thread on a sari. Uncertain, she had hoped to pursue further study in order to become maybe a teacher, but those hopes were suddenly dashed when her parents revealed she was engaged to Krishna, the "you should be thankful for her mother," the son of the most well-known family in the village, had stated in a tone that was a mix of pride and reprimand that the Modas are a fine family. Your life will be comfortable with Krishna. But as Priya sat there, the weight of the antique gold jewelry made her feel more like shackles rather than decorations, and she couldn't get rid of the impression that she was being taken to a jail instead of a fresh life. The drumming and singing became more intense as the groom's procession. Priya's pulse raced as she approached, since she would be leaving the Soul House in a few hours. She had never lived with outsiders who would have assumed she would be the ideal daughter-in-law and ultimately mother. When the last preparations were being made, Priya saw a picture of herself in the despite being gorgeous and wearing all the wedding accoutrements. The girl peering back at her had a distinct expression in her eyes. Priya had no idea that Case 1 was about dreams postponed and an uncertain future. What should have been the happiest day of her life was rather only the start of a trip that would test. Priya nodded solemnly, her eyes sad as her fortitude challenged her conviction. According to custom, she could sense the critical looks of her new family members, including Arjun's father, Shinwantra, a man his little sister Pooja gave Priya a modest, empathetic grin, and his presence appeared to demand respect. Karan, the oldest brother, had a suggestion in his eyes that Priya wasn't able to fully interpret. During the first several weeks in the Indu, woke up to a flurry of new habits and expectations in the Kalyani home. Dawn spent her days taking care of housework and going to bed late before helping Sitri in the kitchen. Arjun stayed aloof, despite the rest of the family having retired and being exhausted. As the days stretched into weeks, their encounters amounted to awkward silences and quick chats. Yet, as the weeks became into months, Priya found herself missing the understanding and company she had anticipated to discover. More than anything else, she longed for the life she had left behind in her marriage. Indu was cleaning the dinner table one evening when she came upon the books she used to read and the fantasies she used to cherish. Heard a conversation between Shinwantra and Sitri that chilled her to the bone. After 6 months, Shinwantra complained quietly but clearly, "Where is our grandson?" Sitri let out a deep sigh. "Patience. These things take time," said. "Maybe we should have the boy examined by a doctor." My father had 3 boys by the time he reached Arjun's age. Knowing that she now lived in this world, Priya's hands shook as she brought the dishes to the kitchen. A woman's value was determined by her capacity to bear offspring, especially boys, and although she had intended to postpone parenthood in an attempt to persuade Arjun to let her finish her education, but she now understood that such aspirations were that night as she laid next to him, she was stupid in the face of custom and expectation. Priya let herself cry in private for the life she had lost and the seemingly uncertain future as her husband slept. Progressively beyond her control, as their marriage's first anniversary drew near, the strain on Indu and Arjun will emit sharper looks and more intense whispers. Followed Indu everywhere she went, and the ladies in the hamlet would symbolically massage their own big tummies when she passed, while others gave uninvited counsel on old age and reproductive procedures. Wives' stories that are sure to end in pregnancy. Krishna was previously aloof yet kind. Became more and more irritated as the pressure of his family's expectations weighed him down, just as it did on Priya one evening. During an especially heated family meal, during which his father had once more raised the issue of children's Krishna in their private room, he faced Priya and snarled, "What's wrong with you? Why can't you give me a son, Indu? Your normally composed manner is breaking under the stress." I could only look at him with wide, teary eyes since I was so stunned by his outburst. "I'm not sure, but maybe we should see a doctor's face twisted in rage as she stammered. Humiliation, and let everyone in the hamlet know that we failed, but we'll find a different solution." The following day, Sitri declared that she had made plans to see Baba Sheen, a venerated religious figure renowned for his despite her misgivings. Priya was loaded into a car with the intention of blessing couples with conception. Baba Sheen's ashram was the starting point for Krishna and his parent trip that would permanently change their lives. It was a large facility located outside of a nearby town, and the air was thick with the smell of incense. And as they entered the holy man's private chambers and heard the chanting, Indu began to feel uneasy. Baba Sheen, a guy with piercing eyes and a flowing white beard, listened in the pit of her stomach. Biker looked at Priya closely as he described their situation, causing her to move uneasily beneath his. Finally, following an extended period of quiet, Baba Kalyan's voice carried the weight of spiritual authority. Jesus stated that the lady is not the issue, but the audience became quiet as it was revealed that Arjun is not able to father children. The statement hung heavy in the air, and when Indu looked at Krishna, she noticed the color fading from his face. Sitri exchanged startled glances as their entire world abruptly transformed. Yet Baba Kalyan wasn't done. He leaned forward and provided a remedy that would desire priority, his eyes glinting with an eerie glow. He said that there is a method to guarantee the continuation of ancestry, but it demands significant sacrifice and unshakable confidence in the as Baba Sheen described his suggested remedy. Priya sensed the barriers of our predecessors' ways. She wanted to scream and run to escape this thing that was closing in on her. Nightmare, but she stayed put, allowing forces to determine her destiny. She had no control over this visit and had no idea that it would offer the blessing of new life. Would instead start a series of events that would result in death, devastation, and an inevitable reckoning. The trip back to Shanur was cloaked in a thick, oppressive quiet that made Indu sit stiff and shook the very foundations of Shanur. Her thoughts whirling from Baba Kalyan's declaration and the terrible remedy he had suggested, she sat in the back seat. Glanced at Krishna, who was staring blankly out the window with a mask of anguish and guilt on his face, as soon as they Shinwantara summoned the Modas to a family gathering in the living room when they got home, and the tension in the air was palpable. As Vikram repeated Baba Kalyan's statement that Krishna is unable to father children, her pulse raced in her breast. Vikram stated, his voice tight with barely contained rage, "Yet our family can still survive." Sitri's palm flew to her lips as she exclaimed, "Surely you don't mean the grim." Baba Kalyan coldly nodded and stated that it is the only way to ensure the continuation of the mutra for the benefit of our family. The place burst into turmoil, and I had to father a kid with Priya. Kern stared in shock as Pooja sprang to his feet, his face twisted with embarrassment and wrath, and he started crying. Stillness, but it was Priya's response that made them all stop talking. "I won't do it," she murmured in a low but forceful voice. Mistakenly, everyone's gaze shifted to her with a mix of surprise, rage, and in Arjun's case, a Vikrak's expression clouded as a glimmer of thankfulness was swiftly doused by shame. "You have no choice in this. This is about more than just you or your emotions, girl. It's about family, duty, and preservation. Our heritage, but it's wrong." Priya objected, finding bravery she didn't know she had. "It's rape." "Priya, can you possibly believe that this Sitri, who had been quiet up until now, spoke up? Child, you don't realize that when a guy is unable to create heir, this is how things have been done for generations. Our custom, our obligation to the ancestors." Priya surveyed the room in desperation. Sought an ally, but she couldn't find one, not even Krishna. Her husband would look her in the eyes. "I won't do it again," she said, realizing the full extent of the jail she had entered on her wedding day. Her voice trembled, but she was adamant that "I didn't care about your family history or traditions. This is wrong. and I won't be Indu fell after saying those words and ran out of the room, locking herself in the bedroom she shared with Krishna. She heard the muted sounds of arguing continuing as she sobbed and racked her body on the bed. Downstairs, Indu had no idea that her defiance was the result of desperation, and a feeling of injustice had sparked a chain of circumstances that would eventually result in tragedy, bloodshed, an event that would rock the foundations of the entire village of Shinur, not just the Kalyani family. There was an oppressive atmosphere in the days after the family gathering, and Priya felt alone and ostracized by Arjun withdrew within himself and spent a lot of time away from the house, even with the people who were meant to be her family. Unable to accept the truth of his illness and the embarrassment it caused him, Shinwantra and Citriworth they persistently tried to weaken Priya's resolve by alternating between threats and persuasion. Resistance, consider the family, and consider your responsibility as Shinwantra, a Kalyani lady, had a more straightforward stance. You have no say in this issue. He would roar, telling you to follow his instructions, or else you would return to the Hubal you came from ashamed and unwelcome. But Priya started to realize that Kern Arjun's elder brother was the most pernicious danger. His lingering looks, the way he would bump into her one night in the house-cramped passageways while she was Kern accosted her when she was in the kitchen making supper, saying, "You know there's another." Indu recoiled when he said, "I could give you a child without anyone knowing," his breath hot on her neck. Fearful and repulsed, she snarled and brandished a kitchen knife. "Get away from me." Kern retreated, his hands out in a faux surrender, saying, "If you touch me, I'll scream." As the days stretched into weeks, he smirked and added, "Think about it, Bobby. It might be your only way out of this mess." The continual pressure, sidelong looks, and whispered talks that made Privia feel exhausted would halt as soon as she stepped into a room, withdrawing within herself, and only communicating when instructed to do so. Like a ghost haunting the Kalyani house hallways, she went about her everyday tasks throughout this period. One afternoon, Priya discovered a surprising ally in Pooja Arjun's younger sister named "I'm sorry," Pooja said as she carefully approached Priya, who was sitting by herself in the yard holding back tears. "What they're asking of you, sitting next to her, is wrong." Indu gazed at her, shocked by this display of support. "So why don't you say something?" she said, her voice tinged with resentment, and Pooja's eyes were watering. She confessed to being afraid because her father may be nasty when he doesn't get his way. "She constantly sides with him, mother. But I want you to know that you're not alone, and that I'm here to assist if I can." In the middle of her nightmare, Priya stretched out and gripped Poo's hand, feeling thankful for this simple gesture. "Thank you," she said. Muttered, yet this brief moment of intimacy was observed from the house window, as Indu lay awake in bed that night. She interacted with narrowed eyes and squeezed her lips into a thin line of disdain. Krishna was sleeping restlessly next to her when she decided she could no longer live in this place. Had to flee in order to figure out a way out before it was too late, but Priya was unaware that her choice was motivated by desperation. And a strong need for freedom would start a series of events that would result in tragedy, violence, and a dawn dawned over Shinur, and everyone in the Kalyani household had to face the fact that it would permanently alter their lives. Priya's determination became stronger as she spent the night organizing her escape, her thoughts whirling with potential outcomes and anxieties. With shaking hands, she started to gather information, since she knew she needed to move quickly before the family's intentions could be implemented. The few items she could claim as her own, a change of clothes, and the meager sum of money she had saved from, she packed these paltry funds with the household stipend and a locket that had a photo of her parents. Putting things in a little bag when she heard footsteps coming toward the bedroom door. She became terrified as the door opened. "What do you think you're doing?" she asked, exposing Sit's stern face. "I was just Priya," she said, narrowing her eyes as she took in the sight. Her thoughts raced for a reason, but Citri wasn't duped by the unexpected pace. Or did you really think you could simply walk out of the room? A woman her age came up and grabbed the bag out of Priya's hands. "You are a member of this family, and it is now your responsibility," she snarled in a low, threatening voice. "I can't do what you're doing," Priya pleaded, tears welling in her eyes. You are an unappreciative girl who has hardened your face by telling me to go, which is incorrect. This is how you try to repay us for everything we've done for you. Flee like a robber in the night, since the rest of the household had noticed the disturbance. Shinwatra showed up in the Krishna, and Rule looked in the doorway, his massive form filling the frame behind him. Their expressions were a mix of interest and worry. What's going on here? Vikram questioned. Sitri turned to face her husband as his voice boomed in the little room, her eyes glimmering with rage as she attempted to with Priya's suitcase as proof. She said, "Run away." After everything we had done for her, this unappreciative girl she had intended to leave us, but the fall was shorter than she had anticipated, yet longer than she had planned. She struck the ground with severe agony radiating up her ankle. However, there was no time to think about it, so Indu gritted her teeth, got up, and started to hobble in the direction of she had just arrived at the compound's back gate when she heard a voice that stopped her in her tracks. Tracks? And where do you believe you're headed? Priya's heart turned slowly. She sank as she noticed Kern standing there grinning malevolently. Did you? He snarled as he advanced. Really think we'd leave you unguarded on a night like this? Priya felt a wave of panic come over her, and she frantically searched for a weapon or something to protect herself. She saw a large brass dia lantern on a neighboring ledge, as when Raw lunged for her, Priya snatched the lamp and gave it a violent swing, causing a terrible crunch as he lurched back, blood pouring down his face, and then fell to the ground after making contact with Kern's temple. For a minute, Priya remained frozen in disbelief at what she had done, and then she heard footsteps coming. Her back to reality, she ignored the ache in her ankle and turned to run. She was so excited by the sights and sounds of the Diwali firecrackers that she instantly exploded out onto the street. Erupted all around her, releasing smoke and the horrible scent of gunpowder. As the streets were crowded with people celebrating their festival best, she was pushed by the colorful lights that hung from every structure. She had no clue where she was heading and no strategy other than to escape, her heart thumping in her ears as she made her way through the mob. She just knew that she needed to leave the Kalyani home as far away as possible, but it seems that fate had other plans. Then she struck someone hard as she turned a corner, and strong hands stabilized her by gripping her shoulders. He yelled as she glanced up, her blood turning to cold as she recognized Vikram's face. His eyes were blazing with anger. Priya fought against him, but Vikram was too powerful and started pulling her back toward the house, his fingers severely pinching onto her arm. "Let me go," Priya yelled, but the clamor of the festivities drowned out her pleas, and nobody appeared to notice the conflict occurring in midst of them, or if they did, they decided not to get involved. As they got closer to the Kalyani house, Priya noticed Sitri standing in. She shouted out alone at the doorway, her face white with terror at what was unfolding. Priya collapsed to the ground in the darkness, sobbing uncontrollably, but as the first shock and panic subsided, a new sensation emerged: rage. The unfairness of her circumstances, due to the brutality of the family, she was compelled to join in the culture that permitting such events to occur. While sitting there with her thoughts racing, Priya started to create a strategy since she realized she couldn't depend on anybody else to save her. Little did the Motas know that she would have to do it herself at any costs if she wanted to get out of this nightmare. Understand that in their attempt to manipulate Priya, they had unintentionally started a series of events that would result in tragedy, bloodshed, and a reckoning that would rock their family's foundations and the village as a whole. In the faint light of the storage room, the days went by in a fog. Was given just enough food and only permitted to leave for short periods of time, usually under the supervision of Kern or Sitri, and water to keep her alive, but it was obvious that the family's tolerance was running low. Here I overheard a talk that chilled her to the bone during one of her quick trips to the restroom. Although it wasn't the holiday, Shinwatra and Sitri were talking about preparations for the next Diwali celebration. Item attracted Priya's notice. It must be completed quickly. Vikram was stating his speaking quietly, but clearly, We'll use the festival's pandemonium as a cover so that nobody would wonder why she hasn't been seen for a while. It was too quiet for Priya to hear Sit's response, but Vikram's subsequent remarks were unmistakably, "This ends on Diwali night in one way or another, regardless of her willingness," as Priya was dragged back. Her thoughts were racing as she made her way to her temporary jail. She knew that time was running short and that whatever happened, it would happen. Would be during Diwali, which was just 3 days away, and she had to act quickly that evening. Priya started to systematically investigate her confinement as the house went quiet. She ran her fingertips over the walls, feeling for any vulnerability or chance. It was when she was looking at the antique furnishings kept in the room that she made a finding that gave her a sudden sense of hope. Placed under an antique cabinet and partially disguised by a ripped piece of wallpaper was a little window that looked to have been sealed off years ago and was filthy. Yet there was a renewed energy. Indu started working on the window with an old nail she had discovered to use as a potential escape method. She worked slowly and carefully, being mindful that any disturbance may cause the paint and putty to peel off and seal it shut. Notify her family of her activities while she worked. Priya's thoughts shifted to what might she knew. She couldn't return to her parents after her escape, because the embarrassment and shame would be too much, for she would have to leave Shanur for them to tolerate in their small, Orthodox community. Completely move to a city where she could blend in with the others and start again. But first, she had to leave this room and this home, which had turned become her jail, before Diwali and before Shinwantra could execute any horrible scheme he had in mind. And when dawn dawned the day before Diwali, Priya at last sensed the window squeaked quietly as she pulled it open, allowing a breath of air to enter. She looked out, her heart lowering as she breathed in fresh air for the first time in days. She was aware that the drop to the earth was farther than she had anticipated, but she had no other choice and no time tonight. She would make her getaway and run the danger of falling when the family was preoccupied with Diwali preparations. As she heard the household starting to awaken, Indu hurriedly closed the window and gave up all for a chance at freedom. Priya went back to her normal location as Sitri served her apathetic food. Keeping her eyes downcast and concealing the spark of little, did the Motas realize that their victim had managed to escape, and that the resolve that now blazed inside her, in addition to the Diwali festivities, the next evening will bring about a number of things that would alter their lives forever. Priya's favorite holiday has always been Diwali, the festival of lights. Festivities. But this year, as darkness descended over Shanur and the first firecrackers exploded despite the distance, she sensed the Malhotra household's stern determination. So there was a lot of activity going on in the kitchen as Sitri and Pooja prepared candies and nighttime snacks while Kern and Vikram were arranging oil lamps across the courtyard. Krishna had been assigned to purchase last-minute groceries from the marketplace amid all the chaos. For the time being, Priya had been forgotten and left alone in the storage room. Her opportunity. She pushed open the window. She had fought so hard to unseal the noises of celebration with shaky hands. From the settlement offered ideal protection as she squirmed through the narrow aperture and briefly hung there. Feet hanging over the floor, then inhaling deeply, she released that the atmosphere in the courtroom was so tense and full with whispered talks that it felt like all of Shanur and a large portion of the neighborhood had gathered to see the trial of young bride Priya. Malhotra, who was charged with Priya, whose face was pallid, sat at the defendant's table after killing her father-in-law. Aditya Sharma, her court-appointed attorney, shuffled through her side, calm. The prosecutor, a heavy-set guy, had a severe, determined expression on his face as he read his paper, Rs. Rajesh Gupta, who went under that name, was confident and convinced of an easy conviction as the hush descended over the chamber as the judge entered and the court was called to order the trial that would rock the foundations. Gupta's introductory remarks, which marked the beginning of the Shanur tradition, were a masterwork of righteous outrage. Portrayed Priya as a cunning, resentful lady who had betrayed the family that had welcomed her in. He discussed the value of family honor, the purity of tradition, and Priya's crime was appalling. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury. His voice was resonating with conviction as he added, "This is not simply a murder case, This is a story of a lady who disregarded our most revered customs, returned generosity with violence, and destroyed the tranquility of an honorable family and embarrassed our whole community. And justice requires that she be held accountable for her crimes. While Gupta sat as the courtroom echoed with a murmur of agreement, Indu felt the pressure of the condemning steps pushing down on her. But the mood in the courtroom changed as Aditya Sharma took the stand to make his opening remarks. Sharma, one of the honor members of the jury, started off by speaking calmly yet firmly. A co-worker has painted a clear image for you, but it only depicts half of the situation, which I will show you today. The other part, which describes cruelty disguised as tradition and the despair of a young lady pushed to the unimaginable for those who ought to have shielded her throughout the trial's subsequent days, unfurled like a Greek tragedy, with each witness being taken to the stand and contributing a new level of complexity. The chain of events leading up to that terrible Diwali night, which is still in mourning black, testified about pre-disobedience and ingratitude in a calm, venomous manner. As a mute testament to the savagery he said Priya was capable of, Kern described the attack on him and his bandaged head. Shinwatra hissed and assaulted Kern Hune's pained bad sits look as the ungrateful __ attempted to flee. Brought her inside, hardened, she remarked in a chilly voice. Wek, deal with this away from something in Prius broke all the dread, hate, and rage as Vikram pulled her toward the home. A single fiery spark of defiance with a power derived from all the despair of the previous months before he could respond. She yanked herself out of Shinwatra's hold out of desperation. She went blindly past him, past a surprised citizen, and inside the home. The hunting gun she knew Shinwatra kept in his study, which she had saw him cleaning, was the only thing on her mind. Immediately took note of its placement, as though she had known this time would arrive. She arrived in the study a few seconds before him, and she could hear Shinwatra's heavy boots and angry yells behind her. As Shinwatra rushed into the room, Indu turned the weapon up and closed her hands around its chilly metal. Directed straight at him, causing time to appear to stop and the Vikram to freeze. His eyes widened in surprise and dismay as he spoke, and his voice became instantly wary. Don't put it down. Do this. But Priya's hands remained firm and her eyes were clear at that precise time. Precisely what she desired to accomplish, she whispered, scarcely raising her voice above a whisper. No more suffering, no more dread, no additionally. The gunshot's sound was muffled by the outside Diwali firework explosion, but its effects would reverberate across Shinur for years to come, permanently altering the Kalyani family's life as well as that of the young bride who had the audacity to contrary to custom. The gunshot briefly muffled the Diwali noises as it reverberated around the Kalyani residence. For a brief moment, the festivities outside were quiet, and suddenly mayhem broke out. With a shocked expression on his face, Viram staggered backward and fell to the ground. A deep crimson stain appeared on his immaculate white kurta, as blood bloomed over his breast. Unable to properly fathom what she had just experienced, Priya remained still, the gun firmly gripped in her trembling hands. As she hurried into the room, Dunsit's agonized cry pierced the air, and she fell to her knees next to her. "What have you done, fallen husband?" she sobbed, turning to face Priya with a combination of the rest of the family was drawn in by the noise, which filled her eyes with fear and loathing. Arjun emerged in the doorway, his eyes enlarging as he absorbed the picture in front of him. Pooja, behind him, gave a strangled. Kern was the first to act, causing her to weep and put her hands to her lips in disbelief. He pushed forward, tearing the blood from his previous experience with Priya, even though it was still streaming down his face. "You'll pay for this," he said, snatching the weapon from her unresisting hands. Raising the weapon as though to hit her, Arjun's voice startledly boomed out. With a grim expression of purpose, he stood between Priya and Rule in an authoritative manner. "There has been enough bloodshed tonight, and for a little while it seems that Kern could resist his brother, but gradually he dropped the weapon and whispered, 'We need to call for help,' his voice trembling. As if awakened from a trance, everyone erupted in a combination of horror and wrath, and Pooja rushed to call for Krishna, knelt next to his father, and applied pressure to the wound in a futile manner while the police and ambulance arrived. Citri kept screaming as a disturbing counterpoint to the joyful endeavor to stop the bleeding. Through it all, the noises of the celebration continued to reverberate from outside. She remained still, her mind unable to comprehend the magnitude of what had just transpired. She had desired independence, wanted to get away, but this was more than she could have ever dreamed. The following several hours flew by, with the ambulance arriving and the grim-faced paramedics declaring Vikram dead as they led Indu away on the scene. The cops asked pointed, probing inquiries and had judgmental eyes. Handcuffs, with the last of the Diwali lamps dying out as dawn broke over Shanur. The news of the revered Vikram Malhotra's death sent the town into a frenzy. In the chilly light of day, the scandal involving his own daughter-in-law was unlike anything the sleepy village had ever witnessed. The full consequences of her actions suddenly hit Priya as she sat in a small police cell. She had murdered a man while attempting to flee. She had already sentenced herself to a much harsher jail, yet even as a little part of Priya refused to give up when hopelessness threatened to overtake her. Certainly, she had behaved in desperation, but additionally, out of a deep-seated need for justice. If she were to be held accountable for her crimes, the truth would come out. Would need to come out as she awaited the arrival of her attorney. Indu started to collect her thoughts and ready herself for the fight ahead. She was aware that she was already condemned in the eyes of the law and the public. However, she was adamant about speaking up and exposing the harsh customs and familial pressure that had pushed her to because of this desperate deed. Priya's years in jail served as a period of introspection, and however, she took advantage of the chance to continue her studies and obtained a degree through a program for inmate education. Became a spokesperson for other women facing like circumstances, sharing her case and giving individuals who felt constrained by custom and circumstance hope. When they eventually left jail 5 years later, she stepped out into a society that had undergone several changes as a result of her instance prompted a government investigation that resulted in new legislation. Enhancing women's rights and safeguards against forced marriage and domestic violence had been declared illegal, but it would take years for the legislation to be properly applied in reality. Destroyed the Kalyani family's image and left the local Krishna feeling guilty about his during the events. He transformed into a champion for women's rights, striving to subvert the patriarchal norms he had after being accepted without issue. As for Indu, she decided not to. Instead of going back to Shanur, she relocated to Delhi and started working for an NGO that promoted empowerment and education. Her story, which was first a scandal, has evolved into a symbol of defiance against harsh customs. But Priya never forgot the price of her freedom as she embraced her new life and mission. The burden of Shanwantra's passing would never leave her, serving as a constant reminder of the desperate decisions she was made by a system that which prioritized custom over human decency, thus making Priya's situation more than it started as a story of a single woman's suffering, ended up becoming a catalyst for change. A call to a community to reconsider its traditions and ideals. And although the road ahead would not be simple, with every woman was empowered by the girl's education. Every antiquated custom was questioned, and a new future where tradition and advancement could coexist was being fashioned. A future in which no woman would have to make decisions that would reconcile the wisdom of the past with the demands of the present. The last-ditch decision Priya had to make that fateful Diwali evening, while standing on the balcony of her little watching the sun set over the busy city from her flat in Delhi. She gave herself a little smile. The journey had been difficult. The cost was considerable, but finally she was free, and the ability to assist others in discovering their own route to liberation accompanied that independence. In the instance of Indu Malhotra, the bride who defied Ishan had become a legend, but it was only the beginning for Indu of a lifetime quest for equality and justice. But Arjun's testimony was what made the difference. He talked haltingly at first, but with increasing confidence, about the strain put on the defenders. He and Priya created an air, and he told Baba Kailan about the visit. When the so-called holy man announced that he was infertile and his father suggested the terrible remedy, they were going to coerce her, Arjun continued, "My father was going to rape me," his voice cracking. in the sake of tradition and family honor, and I was too much of her attempt to halt it, causing a startled outcry to reverberate around the courtroom. Gupta tried to have Arjun's evidence removed from the record, since the jurors were clearly disturbed. But after the court overturned his decision, Priya took the stand. As she made her way to the witness box, she felt the pressure of all the eyes in the courtroom on her. This was her chance, maybe her lone opportunity to present her case. So she took a big breath before speaking. Talked about how an arranged marriage had interrupted her aspirations for education. Throughout the hamlet, she was followed by critical glances and whispers about the growing pressure to have a child. She described the terror of discovering the family scheme, the desperation that prompted her to try to flee, and the "I never wanted to murder anyone," Priya remarked during the altercation that resulted in Shinwantra's death. Despite the tears that tried to spill, her voice remained firm. "All I wanted was the freedom to live my life as I saw fit. Is it really too much to ask for my own life?" Given that Priya resigned from the witness stand, a thick quiet descended around the courtroom. As her straightforward eloquence hit a chord compelling in his concluding remarks, he urged individuals to face up to hard realities regarding the customs they had long taken for granted. Attica Sharma emphasized that this issue involves more than one lady or family. Rather, it concerns the cost of mindlessly adhering to tradition at the expense of fundamental rights and human dignity. P.R.I. Malhotra's activities were a last reaction in the face of unspeakable brutality, and condemning her would be the same as condoning the "I implore the jury, MERS, to take into account not just the text of the law, but also the mechanism that led her to this place." Courage to think about what true justice would look like in a society where our most treasured customs might become tools of oppression. The mood when the jury filed out to start deliberating was electrifying in the courtroom, and regardless of the verdict, it was obvious that the consequences of this case will be felt well beyond the courthouse's boundaries. The jury's 3-day deliberations seemed to go on forever for Indu. When it eventually arrived, she sat in her cell, divided between hope and despair. Cher appeared to hold its breath as it was announced that a verdict had been rendered. You might have heard a pin drop in the courtroom as the jury foreman stood to announce the verdict on the murder accusation. There was a collective gasp as the defendant, Indu Kalyani, was found not guilty in the first degree. The gathered audience, then a cacophony of voices, some of which rejoiced, while the judge had to repeatedly pound his gavel to restore order, as others noisily objected. But the foreman Priya thought that the defendant was guilty of the lesser crime of manslaughter once the silence had been restored. The word replayed in her head as if the earth had fallen away from her. While the jury had been persuaded that Priya had acted in an extreme manner, the judge said as she started to address under duress, they were unable to fully exonerate her of involvement for Shinwantra's demise. In the days that followed, Shinur was a town, and the punishment hearing was scheduled for the next week. Divided, the case had made many people face hard realities about their culture and the customs they had long cherished. Some came together to support Priya and demand mercy, and others who saw her as a danger to the foundation of their way of life urged severe punishment. When it came to sentence, the judge's ruling on the day of sentence took into account the intricacy of the case, and was given a jail sentence of 5 years. Which is far less than the typical punishment for manslaughter. But the court went on to say that this case has revealed a sinister side to some of our most treasured customs. Voice grave, it is evident that we must reevaluate our ideals as a culture and procedures. Hence, I'm suggesting a sentence for the defendant, in addition to a thorough government investigation of forced marriage, marital rape, and other types of domestic violence. The judge's remarks, which were concealed under the pretense of tradition, shocked Shinur and beyond. In the weeks and in the months that followed, Priya's case served as a catalyst for women's rights advocates all around India.